just like glam, shining bright, colors dance in the night, in the light. With colors so divine, mirror, mirror, show me now.
Things that we're seeking in these motions to compel are things that are outlined in the probable cause affidavit.
Hi, we're here at ISHE 29 with Craig Klugman. Craig, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a bioethicist at DePaul University in Chicago, and I've been there for 5 years, and my background is in bioethics and health humanities.
How did you get into that? Very interesting.
There's a short and a long story. I'll give you the medium story here. So growing up, my mom was a nurse for Planned Parenthood and ran an infertility clinic. And my dad was an estate attorney, so he would talk to people about their end-of-life wishes and planning. And so when I took a course in college, it just really spoke to me, and I realized later that it combined the two things that were dinner table conversation growing up.
Absolutely. A lot of ethical debates and things surrounding.
Yeah. So, what we were talking about while we were eating our dinner, apparently people didn't talk about around the dinner table when I got to college. That was a little bit of a surprise. But they did talk about it in the classroom. And so I just sort of fell into this new field that was just beginning at the time and found that it really spoke to me.
That's amazing. You've written a lot about bioethics. Talk a little bit about that, maybe.
So bioethics is a really broad thing, which is why I'm laughing. Bioethics, really, depending on how you look at it, sort of comes after World War II with the experiments done by the Nazis and the Japanese on prisoners, shall we say. And we really sort of started as, we're not treating people well. In those cases, they were torturing them. But then we looked at our own medicine and realized that doctors didn't necessarily talk with patients. They would talk at patients, and they would not tell them what was wrong with them, but they would say, hey, take 2 pills and call me in the morning. That joke is because it was true. And you weren't told what you were taking, and you weren't part of that process of treating yourself. So we evolved in a way around the time as a civil rights movement. That's when we really started getting programs, we started getting centers and media attention, which was all about how do we deal with these new questions of molecular biology. And in 1971 in Time magazine, there was actually a whole issue on the ethics of this new molecular biology, and how do we, as a society, sort of deal with these issues, and how do we think about it? And so bioethics was sort of born out of the latter half of the 20th century.
Very interesting, because I don't think a lot of people know exactly what that term means sometimes, so that's it's fascinating.
Well, the term itself is interesting because it originally referred to, was founded by biochemists and ecologists, and it was supposed to be about our relationship to the world, bioethics.
Sure,
right.
Yeah.
And then in that same issue of Time magazine, where there was all this stuff about the ethics of molecular biology, there was one little article about this guy at the University of Wisconsin who had this thing called bioethics. And he was looking at the environment. And the two published in the same place, everybody just applied bioethics to this work.
Interesting. So how do you approach an ethical challenge, or how would you recommend somebody approach an ethical challenge?
Yeah, so the way I teach this is, first you have to identify that you have an ethical issue, right? So it's not a legal issue, it's not a communication issue. In the hospital, 80% of what we deal with are communications. People just don't know how to talk to one another. So first we try and identify it, and we ask questions like, how would you feel if this got out? If people heard about this, would that be a worry? Or what if this was on the front page of the New York Times? And
That's a great way to approach it.
Yeah, if your action is, oh, that would be uncomfortable for our institution, you might have an ethical issue. Or is nothing happening? Are you making no decisions because nobody can figure out what to do? Or are there differences in values? One group wants to do one thing, one group wants another thing. That can be a sign that there might be an ethical issue involved. So we do that, and then we gather our facts. So we talk to everybody who's involved. We want to make sure that So to prepare for today, I talked to Thomas Callahan, and then I talked to my colleagues in genetics, and then I went through the literature. So we want to make sure that we're sort of up to date with what's going on. And then we will sort of look at what are the ethical issues here. What do we identify as sort of the moral challenges that are facing us? And then we'll look at some theories, some ethical theories, so the philosophy class that everybody loved, I hope.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, at least I did.
Me too. I
And
think
we'll-
everyone wanted to talk about philosophy, just to
Well,
know how to
that's
turn
it.
that into a career. Yes.
Yes, I'm happy I did. Although I was actually a biology major in college, so I kind of went the other direction. Yeah. So we apply the theories to sort of, okay, if we look through different lenses, what do we see here? And then often that leads us to some recommendations. So when I work with policy issues, it's, okay, here's some recommendations. If I work in the hospital, here's some recommendations. We never tell anybody what to do. Like, we don't have any authority. We're not a priest. We're not a lawyer. We're not a judge. We're not legislators. So we can't tell anybody what they have to do. But we can make some recommendations over what we think are better approaches and worse approaches. We're not really about telling people what is right and wrong. We're just sort of identifying what's out there and suggesting, better and worse, rather than do this and don't do this.
Which is probably smart, because I don't know if that ever works. Anyway, so.
Not in my family.
Right, no, mine either. Tell us a little bit about the panel. So genetic genealogy is what you'll be talking about today with a panel. How are you going to approach it? What are your thoughts on how the technology is being used?
So what's interesting about this panel, I think, is that it's people from various and strong viewpoints.
Absolutely.
Right. So we have people who view this sort of investigative genealogy as destruction of privacy and the end of civilization as we know it. And we have other people who are, we're going to solve every crime that we've ever had on the planet. And in the middle is usually where bioethics ends up sitting and looking at what comes from both ways. So I am sort of last in the rotation, and I will be listening very carefully to what everybody says. I do have some remarks I've prepared and some notes I've taken, but I will be changing those as I hear the arguments people are making. So a lot of what I'm going to be doing is identifying where there are logical consistencies, logical problems, and then how does it relate to what the literature has been saying. And some of ethics is just sort of your gut instinct. I've been doing this for 20 years, and there's a sense that you've gained an ethical voice in your head, is a way to think about it, that sort of, throws up little flags and says, wait a second, there's something there that nobody's realizing. And so I'm hoping to find something new that hasn't been discussed before, sort of a new way of thinking about the conversation.
Well, and there are myriad issues. I mean, if you look at it from commercial databases and privacy and how that relates to health data, to using it to solve a cold case, and who's the custodian of what piece of information, and
right, and who owns it. I mean, I'm coming more and more to my thinking that, my DNA is not really mine. It's mine and my 300 closest relatives.
that's a great point. Yeah.
So do I really have the right to give my DNA to a commercial database without having them all sign off on it? I have refused to do it. My spouse has, but we have no genetic relationship.
Okay.
And he has discovered relatives around the world that he didn't know about, which is really interesting and really intriguing to do. But I just feel like the loss of privacy, like, we haven't dealt with the legal and the ethical issues right now, and just throwing my personal DNA out there, I'm afraid that there aren't enough protections in place to know how this will be used and what will be used. And, we see this with the investigative genealogy. If you look at the user agreements for all the commercial and the public databases over the summer as a result of the Golden State Killer, they've all been updated to say, hey, we might give your stuff to law enforcement. And we'll tell you if we can, but we might not be able to. And so now there's a sense of, you have given a piece of yourself away and you don't control it. And that would be fine. If you could consent to that, you can make a choice. Not every choice is a great one, but you can make that choice. But the problem that I see is you're also then making a choice for 300 relatives.
That's very interesting, because familiar search and the way things connect together, or all of the genetic genealogy success stories, are part of a tree, really.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
And we hear about the handful of success stories, but we haven't heard about the hundreds of thousands of people whose records were invaded, were gone through, without them knowing about it, in order to get those few successes. And, if you talk to the investigators, they say, well, we clear more people with this than we catch. And so it's a way of getting people, out of the spotlight. But there's something, we do have this sense of privacy in this country. The Fourth Amendment holds on it. You can't just look at my cell phone. If I'm at, the TSA can't even just look in my cell phone, right?
True, very true.
So why should they be able to look at a DNA database? Another issue that I see here, which is coming about with what we're calling digital medicine, where we're using now technology that's not controlled by the doctors in the hospitals. And so we're used to in medicine the idea of an informed consent, where you give permission to use your materials and your illnesses and your secrets to help you get better. And a lot of people, especially in these public databases, are doing the same thing, right? They're going to these rooms, they're sharing their information to try and find family, but try and find answers to diseases and conditions they might have or that run in their family. And we share that information because we have an expectation that people will keep it confidential, that people are going to keep our secrets to help us. But now those same secrets are being used because these databases own them. And we have not been part of this. So we signed this little informed consent document, but now we're governed by the user agreement. And I was looking at some of the user agreements for these databases. They're 50 pages. I mean, famously, iTunes is 56 pages. Have you ever read the whole thing?
No, certainly not. Facebook, great example of everything that's happened there recently.
Right.
I mean, no, I haven't read them, but
Nobody
I
has read
participate.
these.
And I did 23andMe, and I'm rethinking.
Well, so you have the right to ask them to remove your stuff from the database.
Okay.
However, anybody they've shared it with, anybody who has shared your information, it doesn't get removed. Which is the same thing that happens on Facebook. You could delete your account, but if anybody's liked it or shared it, it's there forever. So, a lot of what I think ethics is coming to in this place is sort of, how do we, now that this exists and people are doing this, how do we put, the barn doors are open, the horses are out, how do we put up fences so that we can make sure that this information is used the way we want it to, instead of this sort of Wild West now where there are very few states that have rules about this.
That's a great point.
And, there's very few protections, if any. And, a lot of this is happening. Well, it's not illegal, so we can do this. But it's also not explicitly legal. So I think it would be better to have some system to do that. And for a lot of this, we're sort of in the new age of this. It would be better to have these conversations to prevent the problems that could become widespread when this is readily available.
Yes, let's be proactive, not reactive.
Right. I mean, if you've ever seen the movie Gattaca, there's this brilliant scene where this woman goes to a kiosk and they swab her mouth. And she says she just got a really big wet kiss from a potential date. Can they examine his DNA? And so they take it off of her lips, and then everybody is scored. They have a ranking based on how their DNA is. And what I'm seeing, and I think what we're seeing a little bit in this investigative genealogy, is that DNA is being used kind of like a credit score. And your worth as a human being, your innocence, your guilt, is often being determined by these techniques that we have some evidence works, but we also know that there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about cross-contamination, secondary, I don't remember the other term, but when you transfer DNA from one person to another, and it can stay there for years in the same place, and the credentialing system isn't up and running yet, and the training is very inconsistent, and some lot of problems. And in my mind, if there's one innocent person who's locked up, then the system's really, really broken. And it's we're sort of set up as a country and a system that you're innocent before you're guilty. And now that we're looking through people's records without them knowing, there's sort of this sense that I have that somebody is guilt by association. It reminds me of the Red Scares of the 50s. Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And it seems like because these databases are focused on different people of socioeconomic levels and minority status and geographic regions, there seems to be that you come under greater suspicion simply because of who you know or where you live. And I think that's a problem.
This is going to be a very interesting panel.
I hope so.
I think so. These are amazing points. I think, a lot of people just don't think through. Naturally, it's very natural. This seems there's a lot of positive things that can come out of this data, but how do we manage it? Yeah.
Right, and I think that's what it comes down to. I'm not coming here saying, no, it's immoral, we can't ever do this. Here's a stone from on high, it says, thou shalt not. But I'm also saying that we should think about this intelligently, and the technology has probably gotten ahead of our thinking. You know, groups like this and organizations like this are important for having these conversations, and that's why I'm so excited to be here, that people are actually thinking about these issues. But I think it needs to go further, and we need to have state and national task forces that are kind of drawing up these rules. I know there's a little of that going on, but it really needs to apply when we've got databases, national databases and state databases. Having a consistent and coherent set of rules would really make everybody's lives easier.
Absolutely. Well, we're so happy you're here. Thank you.
Thank you.
The third motion is held. We had a section called Standard Lab Discovery, and that has to do with other DNA profiles found at the scene. They have provided full discovery for the sheep, the DNA found on the knife sheet, but not the other 3 unidentified male DNA samples, 2 from within the house, 1 from outside.
All right. So if I'm understanding your question there, your assertion that we're talking about 3 potential analysis of DNA that was not provided to you, but that has no connection to Mr. Kobe.
Correct.
Any response?
Your Honor, we didn't realize this was going to be an issue today. We had given the defense everything that we received from the lab. They've asked for DNA workups on other people. To the extent that they don't have them, they weren't done. We can't produce something that doesn't exist. We provided everything. There's one outstanding lab report that relates to the forensic examination by the lab personnel of the crime scene itself. He received the dead. That's the only outstanding lab report. Everything else, along with all the notes, is what there is, and it's been provided to the defense. They're hoping that there's something else there. It's not there.
Taylor?
Well, Your Honor, it's part of our third motion to compel. It's still something that we don't have. We also don't have the unexpected corrective actions, unexpected results from the Idaho State Police Forensics Lab for the 6 months before and the 6 months after November 14th, 2022. We did get some, but it's a narrow scope, and we asked for the full year, 6 months before and 6 months after. That's also in our motion.
I'm not here to discuss Idaho's discovery rules or offer legal opinions about constitutional standards. Rather, my area of focus is based on my experience, training, and expertise in forensic DNA litigation, and what a minimum practice standard would be for a reasonably competent trial attorney who must comply with their duty to investigate a case on behalf of their client.
And is that because what you get when you get genetic genealogy?
Well, yes. I mean, forensic evidence is often central in a case, and DNA evidence in particular. And so when there's an item, for example, here of an environmental sample of trace DNA evidence that, as I understand it from reviewing the pleadings, was twice tested, first for an STR profile, and then later for a genomic profile. The question becomes, what is the minimum practice standard for an attorney to be effective in your representation of a client given that type of evidence?
When you're talking about two samples happening, or two tests happening, why shouldn't it be know that?
Well, there are a number of reasons why it's crucial for the attorney to investigate any testing of evidence that is central to a case. And again, here it's an environmental sample of trace DNA that is being tested. And so it's essential for the attorney to know, for a number of reasons, about the details of the testing and the investigation when we're talking specifically about forensic genealogy. Number one is there's pretrial concerns. And those pretrial concerns that can be raised would involve suppression issues and potentially Fourth Amendment issues. These are questions that are very much evolving in the state of our litigation. But to understand the viability of a Fourth Amendment challenge, there has to be a factual investigation. There has to be a determination of the conduct that law enforcement undertook during the forensic analysis of the genealogy. So, for example, was it fast and loose? Was there searching of data banks that violated the terms and conditions of those data banks? Was there surreptitious DNA collection from individuals, targeted individuals in family trees? So these are very fact-specific inquiries that the attorney must know in formulating a suppression challenge under the Fourth Amendment. because it's all about uh, reasonable expectations of privacy. And what's really critical here to understand, and this is close to me from my litigation, um, early on, the government and law enforcement's argument was always there are minimal privacy interests at stake because forensic DNA profile is like a fingerprint. And it says nothing about who the person is. But now with forensic genealogy, we're talking about genomic profiles, potentially whole genomic profiles, or at the very least a SNP profile, single nucleotide polymorphism profile, single nucleotide polymorphism, an SNP profile that contains a vast amount of information that is very, very private. And so this is a real game changer in the privacy interests that are at stake, and that the attorney needs to understand in investigating the case to assess and to evaluate that suppression issue, that Fourth Amendment issue. So that's one issue pre-trial. There's also concerns about reliability. By reliability, I'm not talking necessarily about the forensic genomic profile, but I'm talking about the STR profile. And again, because as I understand it from the pleadings, there were multiple tests on the same evidence, environmental sample trace DNA. One produced a STR profile that I understand from the pleadings is represented as being a single source male profile. The reliability of that needs to be investigated, and certainly through one aspect of that is investigating the laboratory documentation that is provided for the STR testing. But we also have to appreciate, and again, I'm not a DNA scientist or a biologist, but I'm an attorney that works with experts, and I need to know what type of expert to hire. And one thing that I do realize in looking at this is when there's multiple tests of the same piece of evidence, and you have a genomic profile, actually the entire human genome that is typed from this environmental sample trace DNA, or at least an SNP profile, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 700,000 locations of data. What does that tell us about the STR profile markers? So, for example, the STR profile markers, which are typed, are 20 out of 30,000 STR markers overall. And so what I would be investigating with a qualified expert is, number one, I don't know from the pleadings if there's a whole genome profile that's been developed for the forensic genealogy, but if there is, that should contain STR markers. What does that tell us about the reliability of the STR testing? Is there any potential for artifacts? Is there any potential for an undetected low-level mixture? Those types of questions that are potentially available to inquire and ask about, where you have multiple tests of the same piece of evidence, and it's an environmental sample of trace DNA. Now, if it's just an SNP profile, I say yes, but that's 700,000 locations of information that is like a probabilistic future diary of someone's health, medical, and all manner of conditions that are linked to genetics. That may not have the STR markers in it itself, but it will have information, SNP markers in the neighborhood of, so to speak, of STR markers that will also shed light potentially on those STR markers and the reliability of those STR markers. So these are, particularly in a capital case, crucial areas of inquiry that must be undertaken by the defense team in conjunction with experts retained. But they can't even decide what experts to retain without having the discovery. And that's the minimum practice standard. And that's a point that I've made in testimony before courts, where I've been accepted as an expert in Maryland, D.C., and Virginia, that the minimum practice standard is that the attorney must obtain discovery of the scientific testing of an evidence sample. And that, particularly so in the capital case, particularly where we're talking about an environmental sample of trace DNA, it's absolutely crucial to get that discovery because then that informs the scope of the investigation, the experts to hire, what have you. Now, also with respect to forensic genealogy, and so it's important not to separate this out into all these different components. It is, you have the S&P testing, and then you also have the development of these family trees, these database searching. This is all part of the same testing and experiment. They go really hand in hand. You can't unravel them. They really have to be considered together as a single cord of different strands of the testing and experiment, because the attorney needs to know how these family trees have been developed, because we're talking now about trial issues, and the government is introducing the STR profile. They have to introduce statistics that explain the significance of any STR match that the government is identifying as central to its case. And so the defense must investigate ways to cross-examine those statistics and the rarity of that match that the government is attaching great significance to. And so an area to look into and to inquire about are the limits of the statistical tool that the government is using or the state is using, which is based on the premise that sort of what's called a random person not excluded. And that's answering the question of the rarity of a profile in a population of unrelated people. But the key point there is unrelated. So we know there's no universe where a STR profile has no relative. And in fact, in a case involving forensic genealogy, the way that the defendant is identified is by searching a pool of related people. And so we need to be able to investigate and evaluate the rarity of a profile within a related population. And that's a different question than what the government answers with its random person not excluded statistic that is typically used. And so, again, without the discovery of the forensic genealogy, both the testing as well as the experiments that are done with the test results, i.e. the database searches, as well as the family tree build out, the attorney can't investigate that. And in that situation, by not investigating it, is not complying with their duty to investigate that is required, especially in the capital case.
I've heard you say that when you have samples, in this case, you're getting a sample from a thing from an Irish. That was STR testing done, and then when you go, when you have genetic genealogy testing, you end up with whole genome testing or an SNP profile. Did I understand that?
Yes, and it's unclear to me at this point what type of genomic profile was developed, whether it was a whole genome sequence or whether it was an SNP profile, which contains about 700,000 locations of very personal private information.
I didn't hear you say that no matter which one of those was done for genetic genealogy, that you need to look at those to test the reliability of the STR profile. Did I hear that right?
Yes. So this is as an attorney and not a scientist, but as an attorney who has a duty to investigate. This now is an area where the attorney will look to retain a qualified expert who can evaluate and assess the linkages between the SNP profile or whole genomic profile and the STR profile. To be sure, an SNP profile or forensic genomic profile can't be searched in codes. It's not that type of situation. They can't be directly compared. But there are techniques that can evaluate if it is a whole genomic profile. You would look to a scientist who then would be targeting the areas of the whole genomic profile that comprise the STR profile. Then evaluate the reliability of the STR profile, the potential for any mixtures, potential for artifacts from the STR profile. Or if it's an SNP profile which doesn't have the STR locations in it, then you would look for an expert who understands that the neighboring regions around where the STR markers can be evaluated and assessed to provide information about what the STR markers do.
Can I clarify something? Sure. So what you're saying is that you need to look at the qualified scientists. We have to look at the SNP profile to compare it to the SPP profile for the reliability of the SPP profile.
The STR.
STR.
Yes, so there could be clues, absolutely, that could be discerned from an analysis of the SNP or whole genomic profile. Because again, we're talking about two different tests of the same piece of evidence. And there have been in peer-reviewed publication, I mean, one that comes to mind is Jaehee Kim, who published in the journal Cell about how there can an SNP profile can be linked to an its STR profile. And that's by zeroing in on sort of the neighboring regions and examining those. So again, I'm not a biologist or scientist, but I'm an attorney, who has a duty to investigate. To investigate requires hiring experts to examine this data, this discovery that hasn't been produced yet. And so that's why the minimum practice standard is to get that discovery so that the attorney can then assess that discovery and then retain a qualified scientist to help understand the extent to which the SNP testing will shed light on the reliability of the STR testing that has already been done on the same study.
So that having that profile on the SNP can verify the legitimacy of the STR.
Right. So that's my hypothesis. That's what I go to the expert to inquire about. Because again, this is a very, very much an emerging area of forensic science and litigation. And yes,
I'm going to exactly. I don't believe that this is qualified to opine on Loci and any scientific processes. He just indicated that it's his personal hypothesis. I would remove my objection on that.
Well, I'm going to overrule that because I asked questions. I apologize. Go ahead. Ask your next question.
When I was talking about either the whole genome or the SNP profile, am I looking for just like a sheet of paper that has a bunch of numbers on it, or is there a packet of information that I need to go to my expert?
No, you need the raw data of the profile along with it's similar to the sort of data that you obtain for the STR testing. You get the raw data of the profile, you get the laboratory protocols, you get all the bench notes, how the profile was generated, but also you should get the discovery about how the profile was then searched in different databases and family trees constructed.
That was going to be my next question. I heard you say that we can't look at this whole genome sequencing or the SNP in one category and then look at the building the tree to identify from the genetic genealogy piece, the genealogist piece, in its own separate areas. That they're not two separate ways that they combine.
Yes, they go hand in hand. Do one for the other. I mean, they go together.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Can you tell me why? Can you explain why you say they go together, why you need code?
Oh, well, the SNP profile is what is searched in the ancestry database to then identify, potential relatives. And then family trees are built out. That's the object of the SNP testing. What's important to know from a defense perspective in terms of trial work and potential areas of cross-examination is not just going to be introducing a statistic that are premised on the assumption of a unrelated universe of people. So what's the chance of finding a profile in a population where there's no relationship relatedness between that profile and anyone in that group? And so, as you know from talking about this whole concept of forensic genealogy, people who are related have similar DNA. And so the statistics change when you are talking about a chance of finding a profile within a related pool or related universe of individual. And that's a legitimate area of inquiry from cross-examination for the defense to demonstrate the limitations of the statistical question that the state is presenting to its expert witness. And to do that, you need to know, for example, who the population of related people are, because often from my work on the forensic genealogy, what I've seen is that when a match is found, when the STR match is found, then all building out, all further testing stops on the forensic genealogy side. And so it's important to know who hasn't been tested on the related person side in terms of developing cross-examination about the limitation of the statistical tool that the state uses in its case to demonstrate the rarity of the match that will be done.
Have you received genetic genealogy materials in the
Yes. So, which wasn't surprising to me because even though typically the government doesn't seek to introduce the forensic genealogy, in its case, it nevertheless is evidence that is a scientific test of material in the case. And so the discovery rules typically call, for example, in Maryland and the District of Columbia, call for discovery of scientific testing of evidence in a case, and that's regardless of whether the government is going to introduce it or not. DC is a little different, where it requires either a materiality showing or that the item is introduced in the evidence. And so even when there's a limitation on the item being introduced in the evidence, that really goes to the item tested, which here is the environmental sample of trace DNA. And of course, the government has twice tested it. And so um, for the attorney to be able to fulfill their duty to investigate and satisfy the minimum practice standards, they should have access to the scientific testing of that item of evidence, which is central to the case.
line that starts there. However, I would direct you to the paragraph at the beginning of the map that says this is a possible route to travel between the two locations.
So you're just not sure.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. That would include then Highway 95 south of Moscow.
Yes, ma'am.
And that would include other possible routes.
Yes, ma'am.
How many video surveillance attempts did you make to get video from businesses or homes on all of those routes?
I do not recall, but it continued for some time, attempting to find additional video footage.
What did you find?
Nothing to my recollection.
Not one video depicting the car.
To my memory, no.
Good enough. The rest of them, 335, 336, 337, 338, and 339. The state has indicated that we've been given everything there is and nothing else exists. This all has to do with vehicle identification, and we're talking about identifying a car in question from a video as being a 2011 to 13 Elantra. They say we have it all. So if we have it all, that's great. I just don't want any surprises. The first AT&T record, we called it today the 48-hour AT&T record of Brian's call detail record. If you were to take that and do an analysis on a call detail record, how long would that be?
Depends on the analysis. So I'll qualify that answer with looking at what was put into the second warrant that shows us at least parts of that analysis to include a route that was identified. To do it reliably and feel comfortable that I'm accurate, 3 hours, and that's if you know what you're doing and you have all the tools at your disposal. Arguably, you could spend half a day or more doing that very easily.
To do that, do you just take these records, printed copy, and know what's on there, or do you have to do something with those records?
You would have to use some type of a mapping platform software, and you would take the digital copy, which is typically a text file, you would import it into that program, which would then map everything. But if I'm going to use those results, search warrant affidavit, for example, there's a process that I'm going to go through to confirm the accuracy, because in theory, if I'm wrong, the entire linchpin of that case is now hinged on this affidavit that I wrote. So before I commit to swearing out to an affidavit, hey, this is what the phone is doing, X, Y, and Z, there's a further process of just mapping it to validate it. In this case, there's a lot of time distance measurements that need to be performed that can be extremely time consuming. There's some ulterior issues that come up with how that phone is interacting with other cell sites that needs to be analyzed. Again, saying that a very qualified, competent investigator spending half a day just coming up with that basic summary is very reasonable.
Based on your, I guess, not as thorough as you'll do review of these records, do you have a sense as to whether these records matter to us and what we're doing to defend Mr. Koberger?
Given the timing of these records, from what I can tell in the emails that were produced by Detective Mallory, these records were generated on the 23rd of December. It's when everything started with probable cause statements. If I had to pick a time when the wheels fell off the wagon, that's the date. There are statements and there's assumptions made in the records that will never be supported by the data. There's a lot of claims that are said in these emails, and even the name files of the records are problematic. It does not represent what it's claimed to represent.
Sounds like those might be pretty important to us defending Mr. Koberger.
I had a concern since the very first day I saw the CAS draft report that there are significant errors in the drive testing. It was before I even saw the drive testing. I can look at the coverage areas and I can tell you they're wrong. So yes, it's not a concern that they're wrong. People make mistakes. We can fix things. It's a concern that I still don't have the source data that any expert, not just myself, but anybody could sit down and look at and say, okay, I see what's happening here. Here's how we fix this. Unfortunately, that mistake has a ripple effect, and I'm seeing multiple errors that are happening as a result. So that's why this data is important, is we've reached a point that we need to determine, is this just human error? Is this accidental? Is it intentional? Is there other things at play here that's changing this narrative to where there's clearly some manipulation of the original data? Mapping platform.
Okay. Would that be consistent with this past draft that we heard about earlier?
It's my opinion that Corporal Payne probably is misusing some terms there. I don't see any possibility of the FBI CAS team producing a CAS draft report on the 23rd. I think he's probably mistaken that he saw some type of CAS work product, which would be this map, before they export all those results into a report. So I believe that he probably saw some mapping through a mapping platform. It would really surprise me if there was a physical report. It would be completely out of character.
What did you rely on in producing those? Producing whatever you produced for the grand jury?
What did I produce? As far as the AT&T records?
I want to know what you relied on to do that, to produce something for the grand jury.
I don't understand the question.
Okay. You weren't the main guy with the call detail records or with the CAS-Viz programming. Did I understand that much right?
There was another investigator that was doing that.
Okay. But you end up involved in it somehow in April of 2023, is that right?
That's why I was asked to examine the data to provide that for the grand jury.
Okay. Was that all of your instruction?
What do you mean by that?
Just to be really sure, when you talked about writing the 2 warrants for AT&T, we're talking about 2 warrants that relate to Brian Koberger. There were a lot of other warrants. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
I just want to be really clear on that. You've taken the CAST training. Is that right?
Yes.
And you know there's a way to save your session. Is that correct?
Yes.
And there's also a way just to hit reset and delete your session. Do you know that part too?
Mm-hmm.
And back in April, when you were creating something for the grand jury, you hit reset. Is that right?
Or I just deleted the files out of it. I don't remember if I had reset or deleted. You can delete them individually as well.
You don't remember which thing you did,
I do.
but you decided to delete what you'd created. And you were in this CAST-Viz program, at least for a while, creating exhibits that would be relied on. Is that right?
Yes.
On more than one occasion. Is that right?
Yes.
But you didn't save your work.
You did not create a session log. That's even need.
Would you agree I can't see what you did without your session log? Can't examine what you did without your session log?
It's there to create the visualizations for the exhibits. That's what I use CAST.
But I can't see what you did. Is that right? Is that right? No, it's not right, or no, I can't see what you did.
You cannot, but I could take those cell data or call the.
Tell me what you found when you were preparing for the motion to compel today.
I found session logs that were sent to me from the FBI.
All right. And in those session logs, how many files were there?
I don't remember. I think there were 6 or 7 different items inside.
Did you look at the CastViz 48-hour file?
I don't remember if I did at the time of reception.
Did you look at it yesterday in preparation for this hearing?
I attempted to.
All right. And how about the CastViz full log?
I attempted to yesterday.
This is to try to find out where Mr. Koberger is. In the information that supported this warrant, didn't they already know where Mr. Koberger was?
I reviewed a lot of documents that clearly state not only did they know where he was, they had a surveillance team with eyes on. So yes, it would be unusual for an agency to request this type of equipment. And I need to qualify that. This truck driving around is about $1 million. It's not something you just park in the garage at night. It's a very expensive resource. It's a very technical resource that requires a lot of training and skill to use properly. So typically when it's used, it is used for, hey, we don't know where this person is at and we need to find them. And to be very honest, I don't have an issue with that part. I've used it 1,000 times. It's a good tool. It's a great tool. However, if I know where a subject is, date of December 23rd, but there was also a real-time pin register that was added that extended, I want to say, to the end of December, maybe very first of January.
What's a real-time pin register?
So the second search warrant asked for a couple of different things. Historical records going back to June 23rd to the current date, which was December 23rd. The second piece that was asked for is real-time data from the network, which is commonly referred to as a pin register or trap and trace. And it's the ability of law enforcement to monitor network connections in real time. So as that phone connects to the network for certain reasons, I can see those connections. It's not a wiretap. I can't hear anything. I can't see content, but I can tell the phone is connected to a particular cell tower. There's also what's referred to as ping data, and that's going to be AT&T's estimation of where the phone is at, and that's provided by latitude and longitude, and that comes in every 15 minutes.
state knew what it knew, or why certain things were being looked at before Mr. Koberger's arrest or well into late in the year in 2023 related to the victims, and try to piece together, is that something that the state is still seeking because they're pursuing the alternate suspects that exists in this case? There's so many things that we're trying to understand. So what we're asking you to do is enter an order compelling them to produce the subpoenas. You see that they had at least 2 in their possession that they possess, and it will clarify it for us. And we will be able to create our timeline and put all of these things together and know when and why the state was doing these. We are desperate to find out the timeline in this case and when the state knew what and when. There's no question that motions to suppress are coming. Motions to suppress are coming on warrants. And whether or not those motions to suppress are based on Frank's material because misrepresentations are made depends on the timeline. So if there's a representation made in a warrant that things happened in a certain way, if we are able to look at the timeline and say, we know that the state knew this when, that gives us an answer on whether or not the suppression issue includes a truthful statement in the affidavit.
Essentially convicted in the media. You don't have to read but a few articles to see how negative they are about him. He has a right to have this information withheld, brought out in public so that people can see it's not this neat little package. So people can start to wonder if Brian's innocent. Your Honor, Brian is innocent.